Hello class, I'm Barbetti-Cort, and I am currently an 8th grade math teacher in Oxnard, California. I coach high school and college basketball as well as softball for middle school children. I conducted my research on traumatic brain injuries and their effect on academic performance and quality of life. Each year, the NCAA reports between 1.6 and 3.8 million sports-related traumatic brain injuries. I was one of the many college athletes that suffered from a concussion during my playing time. I had such a severe concussion that I was on bed rest for 8 months. During this time, I had many academic issues and my quality of life was severely diminished. Yet there was minimal information about my concussion symptoms and how I could help myself. This is why I chose to investigate the effect of traumatic brain injuries on quality of life and academic performance. My central research questions targeted the specific issues that I came across while dealing with my traumatic brain injury. My research questions were, what are the participants' perception of how a traumatic brain injury affected their academic performance, and what is the participants' perception of how a traumatic brain injury affected their quality of life? I am the person I am today because of my experiences and my faith. Faith reflects my values, morals, and character, and my experiences give me the chance to practice my faith and demonstrate it to others. Faith is the compass I use to coach and to teach. The purpose for this research directly reflects the kind of character I want to have as a coach and a teacher. I believe that a coach should ensure an athlete doesn't hurt themselves further for the team or for the sport. I think they should also check and recognize for the signs and symptoms of concussions, create a safe and competitive environment for everyone, and lastly, inform the athletes on how a traumatic brain injury can severely impact their lives now and in the future. As a teacher, I think it is also important to recognize the signs and symptoms of a traumatic brain injury. I also would like to allow students to have extra time and give them extra support when they need it. As a teacher, it is my job to create a safe place for children to report symptoms and problems and ensure that every child succeeds in my classroom. As a teacher and as a coach, I am able to ensure a child is academically successful and their quality of life after a traumatic brain injury does not diminish. Mild traumatic brain injuries or severe traumatic brain injuries are a public health concern because of how often it occurs and the lasting symptoms. In 2010, Lobsher dedicated a study with the purpose of investigating the academic consequences of a mild traumatic brain injury in rugby players. These rugby players were compared to each other and to other children at the school that didn't play sports. There were 35 high school rugby players on the team, all between the ages of 16 and 18, that sustained a mild traumatic brain injury. The control group were students that didn't play contact sports that were from the same school, same age, and same education level. The academic results of all three groups in the study were obtained from their records. The results of the final examination of the year of the specific season that they hurt themselves, these were all used to determine the results. English, math, science, and African were the 4 subjects tested. In this case, it was done in Africa, so African is their native language, and English is just a foreign language to them. Descriptive statistics were used on each group to obtain the means and standard deviation of their academic performance. Two-way reported measures were used to compare the academic reports of the 4 subjects. Lobsher found that there was no statistical difference in any subject except for African, the children's native language. In African, which is the native language of the students, there was a significant decrease in academic performance. The control group showed no significant decrease, but the 2 other groups showed significant decrease in academic performance. These results showed that students with the traumatic brain injury were negatively affected in their academic performance in African. If the traumatic brain injury affected the primary language, It may eventually also impact the other academic areas, and it could challenge their communication skills, which is present all the time. The study is important to my research because it directly correlates academic performance and mild traumatic brain injuries. Academic success is directly linked to a person's ability to read, write, and understand their primary language. In 2014, Krause and Richard piloted a study with the purpose of identifying the prevalence of a traumatic brain injury among undergraduate college students and compare these symptoms reported by students with and without traumatic brain injury for the purpose of how often do people receive support from on-campus support when they return to school. The research method was a campus-wide email which recruited participants to an online survey containing questions about their history of traumatic brain injury, experience of their symptoms, and experiences of their symptoms. The participants were all undergraduate students. Out of the 201 undergraduate students, 55% reported no history of a traumatic brain injury or hospitalization. 30% reported a history of hospitalization but no traumatic brain injury, and only 16% reported history of a traumatic brain injury. Significant differences were seen among these groups in their experience of some physical and psychological symptoms, such as dizziness. Most participants reported using no services, and there were no significant differences in the average number of symptoms experienced by those seeking and those not seeking services. The authors concluded that a substantial portion of undergraduates reported history of a TBI, traumatic brain injury, and the experience of symptoms that could negatively affect their performance. The pilot program shows the disconnect between returning to school with a concussion and the use of services by students. When students return to school from a traumatic brain injury, teachers and faculty need to be aware of the difficulty the student is having. If a student is struggling, it is important for them to know where to get help and who to get help from. With this knowledge, students will be more successful in school. Very few studies have ever examined the effect of multiple concussion on the cognitive performance and the recently revised symptom clusters using a large database. They've only been done on a small scale. Three men, Kavasan, Morin, and Wilhelm, created a study to examine concussed athletes with a history of 0 to 3 concussions on a cognitive performance and the recently revised symptom clusters. The independent variables were concussion groups and time. The dependent variables were neurological test scores as measured by the impact testing, which is the immediate post-concussion assessment and cognitive testing, and 4 concussion symptom clusters. There were 596 concussed athletes that were administered the impact test. Just so you know, the impact test is used at almost all colleges to create a baseline for students so that if there was a concussion, they can compare the two results. So these 596 students, took the test between 2 and 4 days after their injury. A series of 4 measures of analysis were performed on impact composite scores and symptom clusters. The results showed that concussions athletes with 3 consecutive concussions were impaired 8 days after a concussion compared with their baseline scores. The authors concluded that concussed athletes with a history of 3 concussions take longer to recover than athletes with 1 or no concussions. This is the same information that smaller studies have found, but this one was major because it happened with almost 600 participants. This study is relevant to my research because it shows the correlation between the number of concussions and recovery time. Each concussion affects the brain for a longer amount of time, and then it will affect the person's quality of life, and also it could affect their academic performance. My research was a used mixed methodology survey that I personally created. The data gathered from all of the participants was analyzed to produce quantitative results. I analyzed the information using SurveyMonkey and determined the significance of the findings. In my research, there were 20 males and females between the ages of 18 and 22. Each participant was a college student athlete who had sustained a mild traumatic brain injury or a severe traumatic brain injury. Their grade point average was calculated prior to the injury and then again after the injury. I got the approval from Ventura College and the University of Redlands, as well as their athletic directors, and this was well documented. The student athletes were recruited from various teams and were informed of the study and requested to volunteer. All students volunteered to participate, and my consent form was sent to them electronically. My survey included 3 sections: A, demographics; B, the effect of traumatic brain injury on academics; and C, the effect of a traumatic brain injury on the quality of life. The survey took 20 minutes or so to complete and was submitted through SurveyMonkey. The first section had 10 questions, demographic questions, that asked the participants about age, gender, race, primary language, prior injuries, and education levels. The second section included 15 questions and used a 5-point Likert scale. These went from strongly agree to strongly disagree. 10 questions pertained to the effect of a traumatic brain injury on the participants' academic performance, and 5 pertained to the effect of a traumatic brain injury on the participants' quality of life. The third section of my survey consisted of 3 open-ended questions which gauged the longevity of participants' symptoms and their experience after returning to school. The participants of my survey answered the brain injury's effect on academic performance and quality of life survey. Most of the participants were women. 85% were women and only 15% were men, and they were between the ages of 18 and 26. Most of my participants were between the ages of 23 and 26, over half of them. The mean age was 24. The participants were mostly Caucasian, 70% were Caucasian, with the next highest being African American, which was 13. Most of the people in my survey have their bachelor's degree, are working to complete that. The results showed that 45% of participants had increased problem paying attention after their traumatic brain injury. 36% of participants had an increased problem concentrating in social situations, and 36% had difficulty getting out of bed every day. The difficulty getting out of bed every day was not physically, but it was just mentally asking yourself to get up and having your body respond. 27% of the participants had problems recalling conversations and interactions with friends, and 27% had a difficulty interacting with new people. Those were the findings on the difficulties with quality of life, and they ranged very much so, and half of the participants had a lot of negative effects, and half of them had rarely any effects, if at all. When I analyzed the results from my survey about the effect on academic performance, it was much different. 45% of the participants had increased problems paying attention and concentrating on academics, as well as they had problems remembering and learning new information. 45% also experienced greater irritability and experienced nausea. 54% were more emotional than usual, and 81% experienced headaches. By far the most The symptom that occurred the most was the 81% of people had headaches. The next one was 64% of participants experienced dizziness. These findings showed that every single participant had some negative effect from the traumatic brain injury. I also found that 50% of participants identified receiving academic support from counselors, disability services, or professors when they returned to school after their injury. Participants that received support upon their return to school did not indicate any change in their GPA. When asked about the support they got when returning to school, they answered as the following. A counselor helped them back into schoolwork and helped them make up their test. Their GPA stayed the same because their school was very good at helping them. Another person said, I received a good amount of support. The disability service on campus worked with me and my professors to allow extra time on assignments and tests. Therefore, my GPA stayed the same. On the other end, another person said, I didn't even think that my school had any services to offer me. I never asked anyone and I just struggled by myself. My GPA was affected going from a B average to a C average. Unfortunately, some people don't know about the services that they could use to help them, and so I think this needs to be widely discussed. Another thing that I found while analyzing the results was enduring symptoms. All participants, every single one, identified headaches and memory as enduring symptoms that affected their quality of life and academic performance. Half of those people said that both of those symptoms, headaches and memory, were affected for the longest amount of time. Migraines, recalling things, the ability to multitask, and emotional issues were all problems for a specific participant. Someone else said, my head is still very sensitive to light, noise, hats, necklaces, sunglasses, or anything that is around my neck area or where I got hit in the head. It's unfortunate that person is still waiting for relief from those symptoms after 2 years. My results showed slightly less than half of the participants had problems paying attention or concentrating on academics. Remembering and learning new information, experiencing greater irritability, and experienced nausea were also affected by half of my participants. A little more than half of the participants were more emotional than usual and experienced fatigue. A majority of participants experienced dizziness, and a vast majority of the participants experienced headaches. Half of the participants reported getting academic help when returning to school. When testing patients a year after a recorded TBI, cognitive outcome and the ability to learn new things is affected the most. Sinha did a study, and he found that participants that the amount of time after a participant's traumatic brain injury was not recorded, but the same symptoms were affected. Participants in the current research reported that they had increased problems remembering and learning new material. The amount of time in the current research was not recorded, but the same symptoms were affected in Sinha's research, which was the cognitive ability and the ability to learn new things. All participants reported that traumatic brain injury negatively affected their academic performance in my research, and half of the respondents identified receiving academic support from counselors, disability services, and professors. This was not found to be the case when in another study done by Stalankny, who investigated how many people get support when returning. He found that most people do not receive support when returning to school after academics. Recovery of the brain directly relates to the recovery time needed to overcome a traumatic brain injury. Stevenson investigated inpatients with mild traumatic brain injuries and measured their serum concentrations of S100B and neuron-specific enolase in acute phase and post-concussion symptoms. The disabilities and life satisfaction over 1 year was recorded. The association between the S100B and the disability supports the notion that long-term consequences of a mild traumatic brain injury may partially be a result of brain tissue injury. These findings are important because tissue may take longer to heal, which causes lasting symptoms. Depending on the severity of the traumatic brain injury, the amount of recovery time may vary. This study demonstrates how each participant's quality of life may be affected differently after sustaining a traumatic brain injury due to the severity of the brain tissue damage. This directly relates to my findings because some people were still recovering while other people were not, and this definitely affects their quality of life. The implications of my studies are professionals such as athletic directors, teachers, administration, even parents and children could use this information to track the health of a child. They could also gauge when they should return to school. They could effectively utilize supports when returning to school and assist the child to persevere through long-lasting symptoms. Teachers must be aware of the symptoms of TBI and how they affect a student-athlete's performance in and out of school. This is a must to make sure that all students are becoming successful when returning to school. Protocol should address excused absences, makeup work, gradual return to full-time, and additional time for classwork and homework assignments. These protocols are not in place, so each school district and each school gets to choose how they would like to handle a student's return from an injury. Future research that I would conduct, it would be useful to design a more comprehensive study that involved more schools and more students with the same type of injury. I would examine factors that influence students' athletes' use of available services during their return to school in an effort to improve the number of students receiving services when they return to school after a traumatic brain injury. I would concentrate on developing new symptom clusters and recovery time for athletes with multiple concussions. I would make some revisions to my study. I would administer part of the survey in person and let them answer the Likert scale questions online. I think that this would allow more in-depth answers to the open-ended questions, but still allow the participants to have it be anonymous. The survey should be administered to a wider variety of students rather than just 20. The more people you get, the better off the results will be of the survey. The limitation of the survey is having to find people with a traumatic brain injury. Many participants had concussions but didn't relate that traumatic brain injury. They assumed that they were different. Educating people on what is considered to be a traumatic brain injury will help generate more data. Results showed that traumatic brain injuries had a significant impact on the student-athlete's academic performance and may have a negative effect on his or her quality of life. The analysis showed that most participants stated that traumatic brain injuries negatively affected their academic performance, yet their GPA was not affected. Despite reporting negative social effects from a traumatic brain injury, most participants reported that their quality of life was not negatively affected. Although the results seem inconsistent, they demonstrate that the majority of participants experienced negative effects on their academic success and experienced symptoms that could have been detrimental to their quality of life. In conclusion, traumatic brain injuries greatly affect a student-athlete's academic performance and hinders their quality of life. This research is important because it suggests that student-athletes need extra time and support when recovering from a traumatic brain injury. The injury affects all aspects of life, not just athletics. Traumatic brain injuries affect all aspects of someone's life, but some are just more evident than others.